April 1859. On the west coast of King William Island in the Canadian Arctic, a search party led by Lieutenant William Hobson comes across a wooden boat mounted on an iron-shod sledge, half sunk in the gravel. Inside are two human skeletons. One is curled in the bow, wrapped and undisturbed. The other lies scattered near the stern, as though animals had been at it. Around them, the boat is loaded with the wreckage of a retreat that makes no sense. Silver forks and spoons, engraved with officers' crests. Two loaded shotguns, standing upright, unfired. A stack of books, among them a novel. Scented soap, slippers, silk handkerchiefs. What the boat does not contain is food. Hobson's men are looking at the last camp of some of the 129 men of a Royal Navy expedition that had vanished into the Arctic 14 years earlier. Dragging that boat, loaded with everything but what they needed, was one of the last things its two occupants ever did. This is the Franklin expedition, one of the most mythologized disasters in the history of polar exploration. In 1845, the British Admiralty sent two Royal Navy ships, and everyone aboard them, into the Canadian Arctic to complete the last blank stretch of the Northwest Passage. Nobody who sailed on either ship was ever seen alive by a European again. What happened to them consumed Victorian Britain for a decade, launched more than 30 search expeditions, and hardened into one of the Empire's most cherished stories of heroism, sacrifice, and duty carried to the edge of the world. The full shape of what actually happened to them took the better part of 2 centuries to come into view. By the standards of 1845, Air, U-Bus and Terror were as close to unsinkable as the Royal Navy knew how to build. Both had already survived years of Antarctic pack ice. For this voyage, their hulls were reinforced with iron plating and internal bracing, their bows sheathed in metal to take the crush of ice. Each carried a small steam locomotive engine, stripped down and adapted to drive a retractable propeller, so that in a dead calm, the ships could push themselves forward under their own power, a capability almost no other Arctic vessel of the era possessed. Below decks, there was steam heating and libraries of more than 1,000 volumes each. In the hold, roughly 3 years of preserved food, a substantial share of it in a novelty of the age, tinned meat and vegetables, sealed by a low-bid contractor named Stephen Goldner, working against the clock to fill the order in time. Command went to Sir John Franklin, 59 years old, a veteran of 2 earlier Arctic expeditions, one of them in 1819, so catastrophic that some of his own starving men had resorted to eating each other to survive it. That history did not disqualify him. If anything, it made him a symbol of what a British officer could endure and still come home to write a book about. Franklin sailed with 128 officers and men, hand-picked from a flood of volunteers, many of them the best educated, most technically capable sailors the Navy had. On the 19th of May 1845, the 2 ships left Greenhithe on the Thames to crowds, a band, and a great deal of newspaper coverage. It was, by any measure available at the time, the best-equipped polar expedition Britain, or anyone else, had ever sent north. 2 whaling captains spoke with the expedition in late July, moored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay, waiting for the ice to open into Lancaster Sound. The crews traded news and mail, the officers seemed in good spirits, and then Air, U-Bus and Terror sailed west, out of the whaling grounds, and out of any further contact with the world that had sent them. Nobody thought much of the silence at first. Arctic expeditions routinely vanished from view for a year or more. That was the nature of the work. The ships spent their first winter, 1845 into 1846, anchored off a barren spit of land called Beechey Island, and it was there, in that first winter, that 3 of the crew died. John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain were buried in the frozen gravel under carefully lettered headboards, the only formal graves the expedition would ever leave behind. By September of 1846, the ships had pushed south and west into the maze of channels off King William Island, and there the ice closed around them for good. They would never sail free again. A year passed with no word. Then, too, by 1848, the Admiralty's own supply schedule for the ships had run out, and still nothing. Search parties began to go north, first a trickle, then, As the 1850s opened with still no trace of a single survivor, a flood, no one pushed harder than the woman who had married him. Lady Jane Franklin refused every official verdict that her husband's expedition should simply be written off, and when the Admiralty's own efforts slowed, she spent a fortune of her own money, and a great deal of her considerable social standing fitting out private search expeditions and lobbying anyone in London who would listen. Her campaign became a public sensation in its own right. Newspapers followed her search ships the way they might follow a war. Out of that decade of searching, magazine engravings, memorial poems, and no confirmed answer, a particular version of Sir John Franklin took shape in the British imagination. Gallant Franklin, the martyr of the passage, a commander who had led his men to the edge of the map in the service of science and empire, and paid for it with his life and theirs, in a manner every reader could be proud of. It was a good story. It had a devoted widow, a vanished hero, and a mystery just open enough to keep newspapers selling copies for a decade. What it did not yet have in the early 1850s was an ending. That ending arrived in pieces, over years, carried back by the search expeditions themselves. In 1859, an expedition funded by Lady Franklin and commanded by Francis Leopold M'Clintock finally found the expedition's own written account of what had happened. Lieutenant William Hobson, working a search line on King William Island, found a stone cairn holding a single sheet of paper filled in twice by two different hands. The first entry, dated April 1847, was almost cheerful. All well. The second entry, squeezed into the margins the following year, told a different story. 24 men, including Sir John Franklin himself, were dead. Franklin had died on the 11th of June 1847, cause unrecorded, and the note announced a decision. The ships, still locked in ice, were being abandoned. The 105 men who remained, under the command of Francis Crozier and James Fitz-James, were setting out on foot, hauling boats over the ice and tundra, making for the Back River, and beyond it the nearest outposts of the Hudson's Bay Company, hundreds of miles to the south. None of them are known to have survived the walk. What Hobson's searchline found scattered along that route over the following weeks told its own story, without a single word of narration. Skeletons, abandoned equipment, and on the coast, a lifeboat mounted on a sledge containing two more of the dead and cargo that made no sense for a party dying of hunger. Heavy silver, books, scented soap. Exactly the boat this film opened with. 105 men had marched into the Arctic and left no survivors and no full account. For Victorian Britain, the note and the boat were, for the moment, as close to an ending as anyone would get. It was enough of an ending to build a monument on, and Britain built one. A cenotaph went up in Westminster Abbey, its epitaph written by a poet laureate married into the Franklin family. Not here, the white north has thy bones, and thou, heroic sailor soul, art passing on thy happier voyage now, toward no earthly pole. Statues followed. Streets were named. Franklin passed into imperial memory as precisely what his widow's decade of campaigning had shaped him into, a martyr who had died advancing science and civilization into the world's last blank space, a man whose worst moment, whatever it truly was, could safely be left undescribed. The precise manner of the crew's final days, what those 105 men actually endured on their long walk south, remained officially a closed question. Nobody in London much wanted it opened. As it happened, someone already had the answer. It had been sitting, unread by the public, in a government office in London since 1854, 5 years before Hobson even found the note. That is the legend Victorian Britain built and kept building for a century and a half. Gallant officers, a doomed march, an empire's grief. It was built in part by refusing to open a report that had already told them what happened. Open the report. In 1854, a Hudson's Bay Company surveyor named John Ray was mapping the Boothia Peninsula when he met a group of Inuit hunters who had a story for him and physical proof to go with it. Some years before, they told him, they had encountered a party of roughly 35 to 40 white men hauling boats and dying of starvation near the mouth of the Back River. Later, other Inuit found the party's final camp, bodies in tents and under an overturned boat, and farther on, more bodies along the shore, at least one showing clear signs that the survivors, at the very end, had cut flesh from the dead to try to survive. The hunters had gathered what they could from the site and offered to sell it to Ray: silver spoons and forks engraved with officers' initials, a small silver plate bearing Sir John Franklin's own name, a Naval Order of Merit medal. Ray did not doubt what he was hearing. He wrote it up carefully, exactly as he had been told, and sent his full report to the Admiralty, including the detail about cannibalism, because it was part of the truth as the witnesses had given it to him, and because he judged correctly that it explained a great deal about how 105 starving men had died with almost no trace. London did not want that explanation. Ray's report became public within weeks, and the reaction was immediate and furious, not at the men who had died, but at the messenger. Lady Jane Franklin, who had spent a decade building her husband into a national symbol, led the charge against it. Her most effective ally was Charles Dickens, then at the height of his fame, who devoted pages of his magazine, Household Words, to demolishing Ray's credibility. Dickens did not dispute that Inuit witnesses had spoken to Ray. He argued in print that their word should never be weighed against the character of British officers, framing native testimony throughout as the unreliable word of what he called savages. It was not a scientific rebuttal. It was a character reference, built entirely on the race of the witnesses rather than the content of what they had actually said. The campaign worked. Ray's testimony was treated in the press and in polite society as an unreliable slander rather than a lead worth investigating, and the Admiralty, never comfortable with the affair, quietly paid him only half of the £10,000 reward it had promised for solid information. The gallant, undescribed version of Franklin's death that Victorian Britain had already built survived the collision almost untouched. It survived because Britain chose, deliberately and on the record, not to believe the only witnesses who actually knew. The file did not stay closed forever, though it took well over a century to fully reopen. In the 1980s, anthropologist Owen Beattie led a team back to Beechey Island and exhumed the 3 graves from that first winter: John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain, preserved almost perfectly by permafrost for over 100 years. Tissue and bone samples from all 3 showed strikingly elevated lead levels, and Beattie proposed that lead, likely leaching from the solder in gold Near's cheaply made tins, had poisoned the crew slowly across the voyage, weakening judgment and immune systems long before starvation or cold finished the job. It became the dominant popular explanation for a generation. Then, in the 1990s, a separate line of research went looking for something else entirely and found it. Forensic anthropologist Anne Keenlyside and her colleagues examined human bones recovered from sites along the King William Island coast, the same stretch of ground the dying overland party had crossed, and found cut marks, breakage patterns, and the particular polish left by boiling bones for marrow, all consistent with defleshing performed by other humans. It matched in physical, measurable detail testimony that Inuit witnesses had given John Ray in 1854, and that Britain had spent a century treating as slander. 140 years after Dickens dismissed it in print, the bones themselves said the witnesses had been right. The final correction came from the same direction as the first. For generations, Inuit families along the central Arctic coast had carried their own oral history of where the ships had gone down, passed on the way. History is passed on in a culture that has always kept it that way, person to person, story to story. British and Canadian search parties largely searched where their own charts and assumptions pointed instead. In September of 2014, a Parks Canada survey team working with Inuit knowledge keepers, among them the respected historian Louis Ku-Mu Kak, who had spent decades collecting and cross-referencing his community's oral testimony about the wrecks, located the remains of HMS Bus in shallow water off the Adelaide Peninsula, close to where that testimony had always placed it. 2 years later, in September of 2016, the Arctic Research Foundation found HMS Terror as well, in Terror Bay, remarkably intact, hatches still closed. Both wreck sites are now jointly managed by Parks Canada and the Inuit Heritage Trust under an agreement that formally recognizes Inuit ownership of anything recovered from them. It took 160 years, a change in whose knowledge Britain and Canada were finally willing to trust, and 2 ships found almost exactly where the people who had never stopped telling the story said they would be. Weigh the case the way it deserves, as separate questions. Did starvation cannibalism happen among the last survivors? On that, the record is no longer in serious dispute. Inuit testimony from 1854 and forensic bone analysis from the 1990s independently agree. Was lead poisoning the reason the expedition collapsed? That is where the evidence gets harder to weigh cleanly. The case for it is real. Beattie's exhumations found genuinely elevated lead in 3 men's remains, and gold Near's rushed, cheaply soldered tins are a documented, plausible source. But the case against treating lead as the single cause has grown since the 1980s. More recent isotope studies on hair and bone samples suggest some of that lead exposure may have predated the voyage entirely, since lead was nearly inescapable in Victorian daily life, in water pipes, in pewter, in ordinary food and drink containers, not just in expedition tins. The honest modern position held by most researchers working the case today is that no single cause explains what happened to Franklin's crew. Scurvy, malnutrition, tuberculosis, extreme cold, and probably some degree of lead exposure combined to grind down 105 men on an overland march that no one could have survived easily, even in good health. The lead theory is not wrong. It simply is not, on its own, the whole verdict, any more than gallant Franklin alone was ever the whole man. So, the verdict. What the evidence does not support is the version Victorian Britain preferred, a clean, undescribed, heroic death, its details safely left to the imagination. What is real and worth taking seriously is harder and more specific. A well-provisioned, technologically advanced expedition still lost to cold, disease, and starvation on a scale that overwhelmed even trained officers. A final march that ended, for at least some of the party, in the deliberate, documented act of eating the dead to try to survive a little longer. And 160 years in which the people who actually knew what happened, first the Inuit witnesses who told John Ray the truth in 1854, later the oral historians who told Parks Canada where to look in 2014, were treated as unreliable until the physical evidence left London no other choice. The real mystery of the Franklin expedition was never really what killed 129 men in the ice. It was how long an empire could manage not to hear an answer it had already been given. Air, bus and terror now rest under Canadian and Inuit protection in the waters their crews died trying to chart. Franklin's cenotaph still stands in Westminster Abbey, epitaph unchanged. If you want more stories from the edge of the map, subscribe, and we will see you on the next one.